The dawn came pale and hesitant over the village, slipping through the thin cracks of a frost-lined window and touching the rough-hewn floorboards of Mai's kitchen. The world outside was quiet but not still. Snow pressed against the door in stubborn drifts, wind scouring the empty streets like it had a purpose, a message only the careful could hear. Inside, Mai crouched by the window, her breath fogging the glass as she traced a circle with a trembling finger, watching the dance of light on the frost. Her fingers were raw from the cold, cracked at the knuckles, and she rubbed them together, listening to the quiet scrape of ice against the weathered siding. The house was silent except for the slow tick of the kitchen clock and the muted cough of her mother, lying in the next room, too tired to rise. The pantry was nearly bare. A few jars, clouded with old sugar and lentils, sat on the shelf, their contents measured and rationed in Mai's mind like gold. The fire, though burning, was a mere whisper of warmth. Each log sizzled reluctantly, as though protesting the chill that seeped through the thin walls. Mai had learned to walk softly through the house, careful not to disturb the small moments of comfort she could coax from the cold, from the pale candlelight, from the brief warmth of shared blankets. She had learned to survive the quiet ache of absence. Her father had left years before, leaving words on a scrap of paper that Mai kept folded beneath a floorboard, words she never dared unfold, fearing the hollow echo of hope that came with them. Outside, the snow lay thick and unbroken, a blanket of quiet that seemed impossible to penetrate. The horizon was a dull gray, the color of wet stone, and the wind carried a thin tang of ice that pricked at the lungs. Mai's eyes scanned the empty street, half expecting it to remain empty forever. Then, almost imperceptibly, there was a shift, a faint knock, hesitant, deliberate, almost swallowed by the roar of the wind. Her heart stuttered in the stillness. The sound was small but certain, a tiny hammer against the door that carried with it a question she could not yet name. She rose, bare feet gripping the cold boards, and moved toward the door with the caution of someone who had long ago learned that the world could offer little but indifference. The door was stiff in its frame, paint flaking, hinges groaning in complaint. Her hand hovered above the handle, unsure whether to open it or retreat into the warmth of routine survival. Breath fogged in the narrow space between her face and the wood. Somewhere deep in her chest, a tremor of fear threaded itself through her resolve, yet another thread woven into the fabric of years spent balancing necessity with hope. When she finally turned the handle and pushed, the door creaked against its frame, a sound loud and intimate in the silent room. And then she saw them, 8 donkeys, all white, lined unevenly in the snow like figures from a dream pressed too close to reality. Their breath steamed in the cold, forming thin, trembling clouds that rose and dissolved into the gray morning. Each animal stood patient, bodies trembling, ears flicking at the wind as if they, too, wondered whether they were welcome in this quiet place. Their eyes, dark and intelligent, met Mai's, holding a weight she could not yet comprehend. But it was not the donkeys themselves that made her breath catch. It was what they carried. Roughly tied bundles sat atop their backs, jostling slightly with each hesitant step. Burlap, fraying at the edges, muffled the shapes within. Some were uneven, heavy, as though cradling a small life beneath layers of straw and cloth. Mai's fingers itched to reach out, to touch, but fear rooted her to the doorway. She wondered if opening it had been a mistake, whether some reckoning had come for her in the form of frost and silence. A flake of snow drifted through the gap between door and frame, landing on the top bundle, melting quickly against the coarse cloth. Mai's mother stirred behind her, coughing softly, pulling a thin blanket closer. Mai did not speak. She could not. Words felt too fragile to carry the weight of what was there. The donkeys shifted, the bundles rising and falling with the motion of their breath. And then, almost imperceptibly, one of the creatures stepped forward, lowering its head in a small gesture of trust. Mai's chest tightened. She felt the pull of responsibility before she understood it fully, as though some invisible cord had tied her to the trembling line of animals in the snow. Each second stretched long, measured in the slow exhale of winter air, in the faint crunch of snow under hooves, in the shallow rhythm of her own heartbeat. She realized, with a clarity that frightened her, that this moment would demand more than endurance. It would demand courage, patience, and a kind of attention she had never thought she possessed. The sun, pale and distant, began to rise above the rooftops, casting a muted glow over the drifts, illuminating the outlines of the donkeys, the contours of the bundles, the frost lining the edges of the doorframe. I stepped forward, one hand extended, trembling, toward the nearest creature, its nose pressed gently against her palm, cold and damp, yet alive with warmth she had not expected. The other animals waited, patient, still, watching her carefully. She bent low, bringing herself closer to the level of the first bundle, listening. The faintest sound emerged, a quiet whimper, a rhythm that belonged neither entirely to human nor to animal. Mai's heart clenched. She understood, in that instant, that her life, so carefully ordered around survival and absence, had shifted. The threshold she crossed now was not merely a door, but a crossing into responsibility, into empathy, into a moral choice that would define her in ways she could not yet foresee. She did not know who had brought the donkeys or why. She did not know the lives she was about to touch or the burden she was about to bear. She only knew the weight of their trust and the chill of the winter morning that pressed insistently against the door. And so, with a quiet, almost imperceptible breath, Mai stepped fully into the doorway, letting the animals into the house, into her life, and into the story that was only just beginning. In the stillness that followed, the snow settled against the walls, the wind sighed, and the candle flickered. Outside, the village remained quiet, indifferent. Inside, a line of 8 trembling white donkeys and the small, resolute girl who had dared to open the door waited together. Some doors, it seemed, opened not for those who expected miracles, but for those willing to carry them. And Mai, without knowing it, had done exactly that. Mai had never seen anything move with such careful deliberation as the 8 donkeys shuffled into her small kitchen, their hooves clattering softly against the uneven wooden floor. The room smelled of cold wood smoke and the faint tang of hay she had stored for the winter, a scent that now mingled with the sharper tang of wet animal coats. She watched them cautiously, her bare feet pressing against the chill of the floorboards, her hand lingering near the first bundle that jostled atop a donkey's back. It was then she noticed the way the animals seemed to communicate without sound, the flick of an ear, a shift in weight, a glance toward her. There was intelligence there, awareness, a silent patience that seemed almost human in its quiet insistence. Curiosity pried at her fear. Mai reached forward, her hand brushing against the coarse hair of the first donkey. It shivered, but did not pull away, its dark eyes reflecting a depth she could not name. The bundle on its back sagged slightly under its own weight, and a soft, muffled sound, almost a cry, leaked from beneath the burlap. Her chest tightened. She knelt slowly, careful not to startle the creature, and lifted a corner of the rough cloth. Beneath it, a small form trembled, wrapped in tattered blankets that smelled faintly of straw and winter frost. The limbs were tiny and fragile, a quiet pulse visible under the fabric. Her fingers hovered for a moment, unsure whether to touch, afraid of breaking what had been entrusted to her care. The muffled sound came again, a soft whimper that sent a shiver through her spine. Her breath fogged the air, mingling with the warm steam from the donkeys' bodies. Mai had never held something so delicate, so wholly dependent, and in that instant, the weight of responsibility pressed upon her shoulders heavier than the cold ever had. She rose slowly, bringing the first bundle to the table and setting it down on a layer of old blankets she dragged from a nearby chair. Each movement was deliberate, careful, reverent. The second donkey stepped forward, tilting its head toward her, and another bundle revealed a similar shape, warmth and life, shivering beneath layers of straw and coarse cloth. The realization came to her in a wave, slow and overwhelming. These were not simply packages of provisions or firewood. They were lives, fragile and abandoned, carried across the snow by creatures whose trust now rested in her hands. The wind rattled the window panes, but inside the room, time seemed to slow. Each donkey waited patiently, muscles coiled like spring, as though they understood the stakes more clearly than Mai herself. She knelt beside the first bundle again, gingerly peeling back the layers of fabric. A faint whimper, a tiny curl of fingers against her palm, and a soft exhalation of breath. A small child, not older than a year, blinked up at her with eyes wide in astonishment and fear. Her heart ached, and yet, in the same motion, a quiet resolve settled into her chest. Fear could wait, this child could not. Mai moved through the kitchen like a careful current, tending to each donkey and its burden in turn. She laid the children gently upon blankets, feeling the heat of life beneath her fingertips, tracing the contours of faces too young to understand the weight they carried. The room, once silent, was now filled with soft whimpers, low nudges of reassurance from the donkeys, and the rustle of straw against floorboards. Every sense was alive, the chill pressing against her skin, the metallic tang of winter air lingering in the doorway, the warmth of bodies close enough to be measured in breaths. Questions began to rise in her mind like the slow mist from her breath. Who had brought them here? Why these animals, these bundles, and why to her door? The world outside had always seemed indifferent, yet somehow, in the silence of dawn and the frost of early morning, it had delivered this responsibility to her. She looked into the eyes of the largest donkey, its white coat dusted with snow, and for the first time, she felt the quiet recognition that she could not turn away. She gathered her courage and moved to the third bundle, noticing the way the smallest donkey followed her, as though insisting that she not falter. The child beneath this layer was lighter, almost impossibly small, yet breathing steadily beneath the blankets she had layered in haste. Mai's hands shook, not from fear alone, but from the weight of trust placed upon her. She remembered her mother, frail and exhausted, lying in the next room, and wondered how she would explain what had come through their door in the night. She did not have an answer, only the certainty that she could not abandon them. The donkeys shifted again, the sound of hooves against floorboards a gentle rhythm that punctuated the soft whimpers. Mai felt a quiet companionship growing between her and these creatures, a bond that transcended words. Each animal, so seemingly fragile, carried within it a story, a burden, a life that demanded protection. The realization settled over her like snow on a winter morning. This was no longer merely about survival for herself or her family. It was about life itself, fragile and urgent, and the choices one must make when confronted with it. By the time she had attended to the last of the 8 bundles, the room was filled with a low hum of existence. Children breathing, donkeys shifting, her own heartbeat steadying in rhythm with theirs. The first timid smiles had begun to appear on the infants' faces, fleeting yet luminous, like early dawn light cutting through the cold gray of winter. Mai leaned back against the table, rubbing her hands together, feeling the warmth of what she had done, though she did not yet understand the full breadth of the task ahead. The wind outside continued its unrelenting call, rattling the windows and pressing the cold against the doorframe. Inside, however, there was movement, life, and an unspoken understanding. The creatures trusted her, and she had chosen to meet them halfway. There was no grand declaration, no dramatic triumph, only the quiet assertion of courage in the face of uncertainty, the small but decisive act of compassion that would set the course for what was to come. I stepped back to observe the scene. The donkeys, now calm, lingered close to the children they had carried across the frozen fields. The infants stirred, wrapped in blankets, their breaths soft and steady. For the first time in a long while, Mai felt that she had crossed into something larger than herself, a threshold marked not by circumstance, but by choice. She had opened the door, and in doing so, allowed the extraordinary to find her in the most ordinary of moments. As the pale sunlight crept higher, painting the frost with a hint of gold, I realized that the morning would demand more from her than she had ever given. Yet within her chest, a quiet certainty had taken root. Fear would not dictate this story. Care, attention, and unwavering resolve would. The animals and children waited, and she would not falter. In that room, amid the chill of winter and the muted colors of dawn, a bond had been formed, silent, fragile, and steadfast. A girl, 8 donkeys, and the burdens they carried together stepped into a world that would test them, shape them, and ultimately reveal the extraordinary capacity of a single act of courage. And I knew, with a weighty clarity that had never come before, that she had made a choice that could not be undone, a choice that would carry her into a story she could not yet fully imagine. The sun had climbed higher, though the pale gray of winter still pressed against the village, casting long shadows through frost-laced streets. I moved among the donkeys and the children, layering blankets, adjusting straw, murmuring quiet reassurances. Her hands, red and raw from the cold, were steady now, guided by a growing certainty. Yet even as warmth gathered within the small room, an uneasy tension lingered at its edges. The bundles had arrived without explanation, and questions that had begun as whispers in the corners of her mind now pressed like wind against a fragile window pane. Who had sent them? Why here? And above all, could she truly keep them safe? By mid-morning, curiosity had become necessity. I wrapped herself in her mother's old shawl, the coarse wool scratching at her neck, and stepped outside, leaving the donkeys tethered near the barn. Snow crunched beneath her feet as she followed the faint trail of hoof prints leading toward the northern road. They were precise, deliberate, and old enough to suggest careful planning, not chance. I traced them with her eyes, scanning for any other sign: broken branches, discarded straw, the imprint of human footprints alongside the animals. The world beyond her village seemed indifferent, yet it had left these breadcrumbs, and she felt compelled to follow them, however far or cold the journey might prove. The first hint of origin came in fragments. A torn strip of burlap snagged on a fence post, a scrap of paper pressed into the snow like a message left too hurriedly. I picked it up with gloved fingers. It bore a mark, a small, faded emblem that she did not recognize at first, a circle enclosing a pair of crossed keys. It was worn, smudged, half erased by frost, but enough to suggest design, intention, authority. Her chest tightened as the weight of possibility settled over her. Someone, somewhere, had deliberately sent these creatures, these children, into the winter, and now she alone held the proof of their journey. She returned to the village, carrying the scrap with care. The neighbors, curious from behind frost-streaked windows, offered half-whispered warnings. "Don't involve yourself," one old woman said, her voice rasping like dry leaves. "Some things are better left alone. If you poke, you'll stir trouble you cannot handle." I nodded silently, her lips pressed together, but the words had no power to change the pull she felt toward the truth. The children needed answers, and in that need, she recognized a moral imperative stronger than fear. Late that afternoon, she visited the small village library, a narrow room with tall shelves and the scent of damp paper. Dust motes floated in the lamplight, drifting in lazy arcs, as if the air itself waited for discovery. I unfurled the scrap of burlap paper across a table and leaned over the catalog of local records, searching for anything resembling the emblem, the crossed keys. Hours passed. The sun shifted behind clouds, and the room darkened, but she persisted, scanning lists of farm licenses, orphanages, and small transport companies. There, in a ledger from 5 years prior, she found the faintest trace, a note about a northern transport operation, marked with the same emblem. It was brief, bureaucratic, and cold. Transport of minors under sanctioned relocation. But there were no names, no destinations, no explanations of care or custody. The formality of the note stood in stark contrast to the trembling lives now resting in her kitchen. The weight of this bureaucratic cruelty pressed upon her. Someone had planned, cataloged, and shipped these children like parcels, relying on snow, night, and neglect to carry them unnoticed. And yet, there was the proof of care. The donkeys had been fed, guided, sheltered, and brought to her. A paradox emerged. Cruelty had met kindness along the journey, and it was now her turn to choose which path would continue. The revelation left her unsettled, the clarity of injustice matched by the quiet possibility of intervention. Mai walked home through the settling dusk, her mind alive with fragments of evidence, testimonies, and speculation. Each step pressed a question into the snow. Why her? Why now? And how had these lies arrived and scathed when the world could have so easily crushed them? She remembered the whispered warnings of her neighbors, the indifferent bureaucracy, the wind pressing cold against her face, and the way the donkeys had waited patiently for her hand. She realized, with the sharpness of insight born of necessity, that the truth alone would not protect these children. She would have to act, to persist in care, and in doing so, to defy the quiet cruelty that had sent them forth. Night had fallen before she returned to the kitchen, and the children were curled under blankets, their breath soft and steady, their tiny hands reaching instinctively for warmth. The donkeys stood close, heads low, tails flicking a vigilant silence that seemed to communicate understanding. Mai knelt beside them, tracing fingers over small arms and legs, listening to the gentle rhythm of life beneath the fabric. The room was dim, lit only by a single candle, but in the glow she saw the fragile endurance of hope mirrored back at her. Each movement she made, each gentle touch, reinforced the bond that had begun when she had first opened the door. There was a sound at the window, a faint tap, almost imperceptible. Mai froze, glancing toward the shadowed frame. Her pulse quickened. Another scrap of evidence, perhaps, or a warning. She moved carefully, candle held high, and found nothing but the swirl of snow and the faint imprint of footsteps pressed into the soft drift outside. The absence of danger only heightened the weight of choice. She understood that every moment of hesitation could cost lives, and that the moral clarity of action, even in small increments, was now hers to wield. In the quiet that followed, Mai spread her discoveries across the table. The torn burlap, the ledger notes, the faint emblem pressed in ink. She examined them under lamplight, tracing lines, imagining the hands that had folded and sent them, the planning that had allowed cruelty to meet chance, the delicate balance of life and neglect. The donkeys shifted softly behind her, their bodies warm against the cold floor, their trust a tether she could not ignore. Mai understood, then, that she had been given more than responsibility. She had been given insight. The children's lives were a testament to resilience, but also a warning, a demonstration of what cruelty could arrange and what vigilance could prevent. She had glimpsed the machinery of neglect and the threads of care interwoven by unknown hands, and now it was hers to strengthen the latter, to shield the vulnerable, and to navigate a world that would neither notice nor intervene unless she compelled it. She worked through the night, compiling what she could, arranging blankets, feeding the donkeys, checking each child. Her fingers bled from scrubbing frost and hauling hay, but she did not pause. Outside, the wind drove snow against the walls and rattled the windows, yet inside there was warmth, life, and the quiet hum of vigilance. Each creature, each child, became a testament to the power of deliberate choice, the fragile victories of attention and care. By the time the candle burned low, Mai paused to look around the room. The children slept fitfully, the donkeys huddled close, and the small pile of evidence rested neatly on the table. The weight of the mystery had not diminished. It had deepened, pressed into the corners of her mind like frost into floorboards. She knew that the dawn would bring not just light, but decisions, that the truth of where these children had come from, and who had sent them, would demand courage. And in that understanding, a quiet determination took root. Mai rose, stretching stiff limbs, feeling the cold seep back into her bones. She glanced toward the door, toward the snow outside, toward the unknown that had delivered 8 white donkeys and fragile lives into her care. The mystery had grown, the stakes had sharpened, and the call of moral action had become impossible to ignore. She had glimpsed cruelty, traced the edges of injustice, and understood that survival alone would not be enough. What the children and the donkeys now needed was protection, persistence, and the quiet, unwavering courage that had brought her this far. And so, as dawn faded into night, Mai set herself against the cold, the indifference, and the cruel machinery she had uncovered, ready to act, ready to defend, and ready to meet whatever truths waited beyond the next step. She had crossed from curiosity into resolve, and the story of 8 white donkeys and the lives they carried was poised to demand everything she could give. The morning broke pale and brittle, a thin veil of gray light filtering through the frost-laced windows. Inside the small kitchen, Mai moved with quiet purpose, stacking blankets, checking the children, brushing hay from the donkeys' coats. The air smelled faintly of straw, damp wool, and the faint tang of winter fire, a mixture that had come to signify life itself in the cold months. Her fingers were raw, her palms cracked, yet she worked steadily, each movement deliberate, each breath measured. She had grown accustomed to the weight of responsibility, but the world beyond the door had not yet revealed whether it would bend to care or cruelty. The first knock came late that morning, deliberate and firm. Mai's heart stuttered as she straightened, wiping her hands on her mother's shawl. She approached the door slowly, her bare feet pressing into the cold floorboards. On the threshold stood a man in uniform, an inspector, official, bureaucratic, and precise. His coat was long and dark, trimmed with a dull gleam of brass buttons, and his eyes scanned the room with a practiced indifference. Behind him, a small entourage of clerks and assistants waited, their glances uncertain, polite, yet heavy with the authority of procedure. "Good morning," the inspector began, his voice even measured. "We've received reports concerning children being relocated through unauthorized channels. We understand 8 minors may be in your care." His gaze swept the room, lingering on the donkeys and the bundles now revealed to be infants and toddlers. "We need to secure them immediately." Mai's hands clenched, her knuckles white. She took a careful step forward, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "They cannot leave like this," she said softly, gesturing toward the donkeys, toward the children. "They have traveled far, they are cold, hungry, and frightened. If you take them now, they will suffer." The inspector's expression did not waver. Procedure was clear, and rules were rules. "We have orders, young lady. We are acting under authority. They will be removed." Mai's chest tightened, but she refused panic. She reached for the bundle nearest her, cradling the smallest child against her shoulder. The infant stirred, tiny fingers brushing her cheek, and a faint whimper escaped lips too young to speak. She lowered her gaze to the donkeys, their heads bent low, eyes dark and intelligent. For a moment, a silent understanding passed between girl and creature, a wordless assertion of trust and care. "You do not understand," she continued, her voice gaining firmness. "These children have been carried across snow, abandoned, left to the cold. Whoever sent them hoped no one would help. But I cannot allow them to suffer again. I cannot let them be taken without consideration for their safety." A clerk shifted uneasily, whispering something under his breath. The inspector paused, then motioned for the others to step back. "You say you have cared for them?" His voice softened slightly, not with kindness, but with curiosity, an acknowledgement that perhaps the world's rules did not account for every situation. Mai nodded. She placed the infants gently on a series of blankets laid across the floor, adjusting each one, ensuring warmth and comfort. She moved to the donkeys, brushing stray hay from their coats, checking their hooves for injuries. "They carried them this far," she said, voice low but clear. "They trusted no one else but me, and they deserve to live with the same care they have been given all along." The inspector regarded her. In the quiet that followed, the room seemed to shrink to the space between them. The measured authority of bureaucracy and the raw, determined courage of a single girl. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, cold and insistent, a reminder of the world's indifference. Yet within, warmth and life pulsed, anchored in the quiet persistence of care. He walked slowly around the room, examining the evidence she had gathered, scraps of burlap, ledger notes, and a faint emblem pressed into the paper. Each item he touched seemed to weigh upon him, the stark evidence of neglect and procedural cruelty pressing against the veneer of official duty. "So this is the truth," he said finally, voice low. "The children were transported, abandoned, but under watch. Someone, perhaps intentionally, perhaps not, ensured their survival until help could be found. And you," he paused, studying her face, "you took responsibility." I met his gaze, unflinching. "I did what I had to," she said. "I do not know who sent them or why, but I do know that leaving them in the snow would have been worse than any law or order." For a long moment, silence held the room. The children stirred, eyes blinking sleepily, small hands curling around fingers, seeking warmth. The donkeys shifted, heads low, ears flicking toward the humans. The inspector stepped back, exhaling slowly, and nodded. "Then we proceed differently." Orders were given. The children were not removed from her care, but placed under supervised protection, ensuring safety and legal oversight. The donkeys remained, their trust acknowledged, their labor and patience recognized. It was not a triumph of force, not a victory of aggression, but a quiet alignment of compassion and law. I watched as officials recorded their notes, whispered into the ledger, their indifference softened by the undeniable reality of care she had provided. When the men departed, leaving the room quiet once more, I sank onto a chair, fingers brushing the back of a donkey's neck. The infants stirred, small murmurs rising in the calm. She touched their heads, adjusted blankets, felt the steady rhythm of life she had helped preserve. The snow outside glimmered in pale afternoon light, untouched, silent, but inside, the warmth of survival, vigilance, and compassion radiated quietly. Her mother stirred from her chair by the fire, frail and worn, and looked around at the scene. You did all this?" she whispered, eyes wide with awe and disbelief. I smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from her mother's cheek. "We did it," she said. "All of us. Together." The donkeys nudged forward, seeking gentle strokes, their bodies a bridge between her courage and the children's fragile trust. I looked around the kitchen, at the straw-lined floor, the blankets, the soft breathing of those she had chosen to protect, and understood fully that the world might remain cold and indifferent, but within these walls she had carved a space where care prevailed, where life had been preserved against odds. Night fell gradually, casting long shadows across the snow outside, turning the village into a quiet, muted tableau. Inside, the children slept, the donkeys rested, and I sat by the fire, hands wrapped around a mug of thin tea. She traced the edges of the ledger notes, the remnants of evidence, and allowed herself the rare luxury of reflection. Courage had been simple in action, but immense in consequence. Fear had been present, yes, but it had not dictated her choices. She glanced toward the door, now firmly closed, frost glinting along its edges. Beyond it lay the unknown, the indifferent world, yet she no longer feared it. The story of 8 white donkeys and the children they carried had reached its turning point. Truth had met authority, and compassion had found its way through the rigid channels of power. The room, warm and alive, stood as testament to perseverance, to moral vigilance, and to the quiet, extraordinary impact of a single resolute heart. I leaned back, exhaling slowly, and watched the candle flicker, shadows dancing along the walls. Some doors opened into uncertainty, some into responsibility, and some into destiny. She had stepped through the first, embraced the second, and now she could see the third stretching forward, a life shaped by courage, care, and unyielding resolve. Outside, the snow lay untouched, pale and silent. Inside, life pulsed, and for the first time in long months, the chill of winter seemed secondary to the warmth of purpose fulfilled. In that quiet, resolute moment, she understood something essential. True power was not in authority or rules, but in the patience to bear what others left behind in the courage to act when the world did nothing, and in the quiet conviction that kindness, sustained and unwavering, could triumph over cruelty. And as the donkeys lowered their heads, the children stirred in soft sleep, and the pale candlelight trembled across the room, I realized she had lived the truth she had long only imagined.